now come to the support for children in hardship bill. The question is that Part 1 stand part. I'll just make it clear that this is debate on clauses 3 to 10 and the schedule. There are, I understand, SOPs number 135, 136 and 137, which also relate to this part. So the question is that Part 1 stand part.
Mr Chair.
Carmel Sepuloni.
Mr Chair, I'm standing to speak at committee stages, and firstly I just want to say that Labor does support the Support for Children in Hardship bill, but we have some major reservations that we'll talk about in detail tonight, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, when we were weighing up whether or not we would support this bill, of course the primary factor that made it difficult is that there is a small offering being made to these families, an additional $25 per family per week. In the scheme of things, Mr Chair, it does very, very little to alleviate the poverty that many of our families are talking about, and we'll go into more detail about that. But there are some areas in this bill, Mr Chair, that we do have major reservations, that we have been looking into thoroughly, that we have been discussing in detail with our stakeholders with. And Mr Chair, I'm going to talk to at least one of those areas in this speech right now, Mr Chair. I guess our primary concern when really digging down on what this bill does and looking for evidence is that actually, Mr Chair, there was no evidence gathered by the national government when pulling together this particular bill. And Mr Chair, I think it's very fair to say that this bill has seen a national government blindly making legislation that is ideology-driven rather than evidence-driven. And I think New Zealand should be really concerned about that, Mr Chair. One of the areas that we have reservations with is the fact that what this bill does is that it changes the requirement for work obligations so that the sole parent has to return to work when their youngest turns 3 rather than 5, Mr Chair. And some may say, why do you have concerns about that? Well, the primary reason that we have concerns about that is because there's no evidence to say that these families will be better off by doing that. In fact, Mr Chair, when we looked for our own evidence and went and looked at international evidence around this, we found in so many countries, including in the US, where work obligations like this were imposed and where women were pushed out into the workforce at earlier stages like this bill requires, in many instances, the research says they actually ended up worse off financially than what they were when they were on welfare. Now, the reason for that, Mr Chair, in the research is that actually many of them were forced to take on any work that they could get, any work they could get into quickly, and more often than not, it was poorly paid work, Mr Chair. There are issues that have been raised with this particular part of the bill around the safety of children and the fact that these women who will be required, well, largely women, not all women, but largely women, who will be required to return to work when their youngest turns 3 rather than 5 will have to look for childcare, for early childhood education, Mr Chair. And we had some concerns about that because we know as a country that recently in our media, our academics have been discussing the fact that there are areas in this country where adequate levels of early childhood education are not available, and let alone adequate levels of early childhood education that is deemed quality early childhood education. So to force these parents back into the workforce when we know that this provision of ECE is a real issue is something that we should all be concerned about, Mr Chair. So, Mr Chair, there are some supplementary order papers that I put up tonight. One of them is in relation to the age issue. We will not be supporting the drop from 5 to 3. In fact, I think I'll make it really clear from the outset, despite the fact that we do support this bill because we found it difficult not to because of that small financial offering that these families will be getting, we can't support the whole of Part 1, Mr Chair, and we'll be voting against that when we get the opportunity to do so. So, Mr Chair, Part 1 is the part of the bill where we see part-time work redefined from 15 hours a week to 20 hours a week, and where we see clauses 4, 6, 7 and 8 reduce the age of children at which the work requirement kicks in for parents from 5 to 3. So one of the SOPs that I've put up deals with those two particular issues. We won't be supporting the drop from 5 to 3. We're supported by almost all of the submitters in relation to that decision, because many of them pointed out the fact that not only is there no evidence to support the fact that these families will be better off if they return to work at that point, but also there were real concerns that the government doesn't support the important role of parenting in this country. We had this discussion at Select Committee. Many of the national government MPs seem to also not realise that we're not necessarily, Mr Chair, we're not necessarily talking about sole parent households with 1 or 2 children. Sometimes we're talking about a sole parent that's been left to raise and look after 3, 4, 5 children. And while I'm on that subject, Mr Chair, I'm just going to say how awesome are those parents that make the decision to stick around and look after their children when in all too many cases they've been left by themselves to do that. I think the other side of the House fails to grasp that. Mr Chair, the clause 4, which changes the definition of part-time work to 20 hours, so it goes from 15 to 20 hours, isn't supported by us as well. Now, one of the reasons for that, there are a few reasons, but one of the reasons for that is that actually in this country at the moment, for 3 and 4-year-olds, we have supposedly 20 hours worth of free ECE per week. Now, if you take into consideration the amount of time that a parent needs to travel to the ECE, then to the work, back to pick them up, then actually, if you're saying 20 hours is the amount of time they have to be in work, then there is a fair enough assumption that the travel time on top of that 20 hours is going to be 22, maybe 23. If you're in Auckland, it could get even more out of control than that. And so, Mr Chair, these parents are being pressured back into work, but the ECE that their children are being provided is not fully subsidised. And when I say fully, I mean free, like the 20 hours that we're talking about. That's an issue. Mr Chair, the other issue with pushing part-time up from 15 to 20 hours is that at the moment we know there are currently 58,000 New Zealanders looking for part-time work, and the fact is that we just do not have that work available for them. So it's an unrealistic expectation to think that we can expect these parents to go from looking for 15 hours of work to looking for 20 hours of work a week, Mr Chair. Also, I'm going to go back to the fact that all too often what it felt like when we were considering this bill was that people were neglecting to realise that actually we were talking in some instances about multiple children. It seemed like everyone thought these were single child households that we were talking about, and that juggling that one child wouldn't be so much of an issue. But we know actually the more children you have, the harder that is to juggle. But at no point was that ever taken into consideration, Mr Chair. So those are the two areas I wanted to talk about at this stage. I know my colleagues have a lot of other areas they want to talk about, and I'm going to stand and talk about some other parts of this bill and my thoughts on that when we get a chance to. But I want to make it really clear, Labor does not support reducing the age in terms of work obligations from 5 to 3 for that youngest child, and I've laid out really clearly why, and we will not be supporting the increase of hours in terms of part-time going from 15 hours a week to 20 hours a week, Mr Chair. Thank you.
Mr Chair.